Good morning and welcome to Housing Today Live. My name is Joey Gardner. I'm contributing editor at Housing Today and I'm chair of this first session this morning. To kick off this special one-day event, I'm very pleased to say I have with me for the next half an hour Geeta Nanda, Chief Executive of Housing Association Metropolitan Thames Valley and currently chair of the G15 Group of large London-based housing associations. Nanda, who was Chief Executive of Thames Valley Housing Association, was one of the pioneers of the build-to-rent sector, setting up London-based operator Fizzy Living, is well known to anyone operating in affordable housing in the capital, but now also representing the G15 Group, whose members own more than 650,000 homes in and around the capital. There is little doubt as to the biggest issue on her current agenda: fire safety and tackling the cladding crisis. The group estimates that G15 organisations have set aside, and Nanda will correct me if I'm wrong, around £3.6 billion for building safety works over the next 15 years and have spent nearly £500 million already, impacting upon both normal planned maintenance and new build investment. But in the last few weeks, new Housing Secretary Michael Gove has announced a new way forward, designed to protect both leaseholders from the cost of fire safety repairs while ensuring that developers and the wider industry pays up to the tune of £4 billion. So Geeta, good morning. Thanks very much for joining us. But before we get into the detail of all that and the new plan, Geeta, why don't you set out for me just how much of a challenge this has all been for housing associations such as Metropolitan, and what the fire safety crisis means both for those that you house and for housing associations as organisations.
Thank you, Joey, and great to be here. It's been an absolutely massive challenge, and I think when people talk about housing and what's going on in housing associations and, generally, it's always the thing that comes top of mind because the scale of what we're having to deal with. And I think you outlined some of that very clearly around the financial challenge, but the biggest challenge, of course, is dealing with our residents. There's been a huge amount of different changes that have gone on, consolidated advice notes, EWS1s, shifting patterns and changes. And of course, what residents want is certainty. They want to know, what's going on. They want to understand what the impact is going to be for them. We need to understand what we should be doing, what our priority should be. So I would say one of the biggest challenges has been navigating our way through this, last few years, where bits of information have come out, it's changed, we've had to change tack, we've not been able to give people solutions. And I think that's one of the most frustrating things really is for people, our colleagues, who are desperately trying to give answers to our leaseholders, but haven't got all the information to be able to do that. So I think that has been an absolutely massive challenge. Of course, we've had to revisit our business plans. We've had to, look at our risk prioritization. We've had to really think about, what this means in terms of our competing priorities of building new homes, of, our planned works programs, our existing commitments that we have, and ensuring the safety of our residents, which is absolutely the #1 priority. So I think, just to start with, there's that. I think the second thing is, of course, there's more changes coming over the hill in terms of Building Safety Act, and that means really understanding the future, not just the now. So you're trying to deal with the challenges of today, which I've outlined, but you're also thinking about what's the data requirement for tomorrow? How are we going to be implementing digital records and systems, systematic understanding of our buildings for the future? So you've got to have these projects running in parallel, and that's a huge capability and resource within your organisation.
And it sounds like it's about trying to make decisions on enormously kind of business critical things like investment in kind of major works and in capital works and things like that on incredibly limited information, and information that's kind of changing and uncertain.
Yeah, I think that's right, Joe. I mean, we've all tried our best, and of course there's, this is not just us as housing associations. We've been talking about this for a long time around the impact and things that are changing. it took some time for the developer community to catch up with what we were saying, and for others to catch up with what we were saying, because we've been talking about this for years now. We've been saying that there is a crisis coming, there are big issues around, but it's obviously caught up, and that this is now obviously one of the biggest things that are being discussed. But it took some time. We were talking about this a few years ago about what the impact is going to be, but there were very few people listening. Then there was advice notes coming out, and all the rest of it, but we were saying this is causing a huge problem for us. It's going to be a huge problem for leaseholders. And I totally understand some of the criticism that we get from leaseholders and etc. around not being able to give clarity, not being able to give timescales. But we weren't able to do that because we didn't have that clarity ourselves. We didn't have the information in order to be able to do that. So, that is incredibly sort of frustrating. And the thing that we keep talking about is around proportionality. We've been talking about that for a long time. We've been talking about layers of protection and how we resolve the crisis around risk prioritization. And we're only now getting to a point, really, where that is seen to be one of the most important issues that we need to resolve in order for us to be able to sort of move forward sensibly on the works that are required, but what's going to be the kind of impact of all of this tomorrow and the day after.
Indeed, and I do want to get onto that EWS 1 issue, the PAS 980 issue, and all of that around proportionality a little bit later, because it's as you say, it's becoming increasingly the critical issue that both housing associations and housing developers are talking about. But if we can go on now, just initially to this GOVE plan, the new plan that came out on January 10th, taking the burden off leaseholders, attempting, it seems, to largely put that burden of cost, certainly for mid-rise buildings of between 11 to 18 metres, onto housing developers, although there has been some attempt to kind of spread that wider onto product manufacturers and others. Does that plan work in your view? Are you a supporter of this, and is this going to help solve the problem?
Absolutely a supporter of the fact that we're moving forwards. And I think, what I was trying to describe earlier was, the chaotic situation we've had and the inability to be able to make decisions and to give information to people and to, take things forward within sensible guidelines. So I think what Michael Gove's plan does is it gives some certainty, obviously, to leaseholders. We have been saying from the very beginning that leaseholders shouldn't pay. We've also been saying, that renters shouldn't pay. Our income comes obviously from our social housing rent. If we're going to be utilising that for building safety works, that means renters are paying. Leaseholders are protected, but renters aren't protected in that scenario. But we've absolutely been clear. Of course, we don't want leaseholders to pay. Nobody should be paying for errors and situations that have developed over the years from poor quality, and much of this is poor quality. There's something around changing regulations, but a lot of this is around poor quality in terms of existing buildings that have been built. So, we really welcome the fact that there's clarity for leaseholders. I have been impressed at the way the government has been very clear with developers that they should be contributing to this fund, as well as remediating buildings where they have that responsibility, whether it's the contractor, whether it's the developer. But there is real clarity that they need to be remediating buildings where there has been where they have caused the issue, and extending the amount of time by which legal action can be taken. These are all really, really helpful things for us as organisations, particularly as we sit down and negotiate for all these buildings. And remember, we've got hundreds of these buildings. The G15 have got hundreds, and London has hundreds and hundreds. It's got the majority of these over 18 metre buildings. So the problem is very much big cities, you know, large organisations that are built in these cities. So it's not like it's spread. It's not like there's a, you know, like every organisation in the country's got the same problem. There is a very big focus for, you know, a number of organisations. So it's very good. I think the developers have been asked to contribute to a fund, that they've been given a target of, you know, 4 billion in which this goes into. So I think there's a lot of good within that. And then noise around making sure we have sort of future proportionality, which has been one of our big asks. So I think, you know, there's lots of sort of positives in there, but I think everybody recognises that this isn't the end game. You know, it'd be wonderful if we could all put a lid on this and say it's all sorted, move on, let's talk about the next thing, but this is going to go on for years. And what we've heard is really just sort of part of the solution. It's not a sort of comprehensive total solution, because you know, because we need everybody in the industry to be singing from the same hymn sheet and working in the same way for this to happen. So, you know, having a clarity on what proportionality means and how we are going to identify and rectify buildings, what comes first, and you know, how those risk assessments are going to be done and what the outcomes are going to be, including the PAS. You know, we talked about that, sort of the new PAS notes, you know, means that there's going to be a huge amount of corralling of different organisations and industries if we're going to get that clarity of output. It also means, of course, that there's more of a financial burden on housing associations because leaseholders are protected. And, you know, no housing association, none of my colleagues in any housing association at all wants to give a bill to leaseholders. I mean, you know, from the very start, everybody has been trying to protect leaseholders as much as possible, because it's horrendous. It's absolutely horrendous hearing the stories and, you know, listening to people, lives are stuck, who, you know, they're in an awful situation, and you know, kind of not being able to solve that situation is very difficult as well, being on the other end of it. But you know, the reason that we've had to give these notices that there could be a bill is because we haven't had that clarity. We still don't know around access to the fund. We still don't know around, you know, costs which are outside of cladding costs, not just the cladding, but everything behind the cladding where there is remediation required. You know, what is going to be paid for from this fund and what's going to be covered. So, you know, there are a lot of asks that we're making, that we want to have access to this fund. We want to have access to this fund for our renters, not just for leaseholders, and for other works, not just for cladding. And so, you know, that all of that needs to be clarified so that we can ensure we can get on with remediating the buildings. The money's going to be there, and this is all going to take a long time. You know, it would be wonderful, wouldn't it, if there was a whole industry there to deal with all of this, and in 2 years' time you could say done it. But it's going to go on for, you know, a decade.
Is it a fair proposal from government, or is it? I mean, it strikes me it's probably a pragmatic proposal in that it's seeking to protect leaseholders, which everyone agrees is the right thing to do, and then beyond that, it's probably trying to find the people who can pay to sort the other problems. So it's probably not funding housing associations for renters, because it's probably saying that housing associations can do that themselves, and then it's probably asking private developers to fund the rest of the problems, whether or not private developers were in any way responsible for those problems.
Yeah, I mean, you know, where there's a building where there's a contract and it's very clear whose responsibility it is, you know, you can move on with it. It's obviously buildings which were built a long time ago, where you know, whoever was responsible at the time doesn't exist anymore, or, you know, it's been that company's been liquidated, or, you know, all the records don't exist as intended, and that is the complicated, you know, those are the complicated scenarios, and there are a lot of them. They're not, you know, they're not a small number, and you know, so I think where there's clarity of contract and we've got, you know, all the information in sight, we can move forward on those quite quickly. It's really where we haven't got that information. But, you know, part of this has been wanting to have parity with private developers who've had access to the Building Safety Fund, you know, for their renters. And we obviously haven't had access for our renters in the Building Safety Fund. So, you know, we are not just looking for special favours, we're looking for that parity. And I suppose the consequences are that other things will have to be put aside. And I do worry about being able to meet housing needs. You know, obviously housing associations have been developers, we have, you know, we have built homes, we have met housing need, and we're a very trusted delivery mechanism for government and for local authorities in terms of meeting a lot of housing need. Now, you can't just turn these things on and off. You know, you can't just sort of turn something off, as we've seen with local authorities. Those years ago, they were big developers, it was turned off. It takes time to bring things back on again. And, you know, a real worry is going to be how are we going to be able to build homes as well as remediate homes, as well as invest in the quality of our existing homes. You know, which is a big, obviously a bigger issue now, is really around, you know, the quality of existing homes and decent homes and, you know, investment in those homes. Really important, equally important to people who are not caught up in the building safety crisis, is the quality of their homes. We've got to, you know, really balance all these different requirements and come up with something which works. And that's difficult when you have a big bill, a short time and a big bill that you need to meet.
And so can you put any numbers on that kind of financial impact on housing associations? You know, I know I'm probably asking the impossible here, but either for G15 or for Metropolitan itself, you know, how much does one have to cut the development program for by? How much does one have to cut the planned maintenance program by because of your focus on fire safety, your essential focus on fire safety?
Well, you know, it is difficult to put a number on it, Joe, because every organisation is different, and you know, it depends on what their covenants are, or which, you know, where are the areas of stress for each of those organisations. So they will each have to make individual decisions. But for the G15, development has been quite substantially, and each association has had to cut their development plans. Now, obviously, there are partnerships you can do with other organisations in order to try and keep things going, and there have been some you know, deals like Hyde with M&G, and Optivo have done some as well, you know, where you're trying to keep development going, but you know, have the payment through investors or in other ways. But the, you know, the reality is everybody has cut their programs. Every one of us has cut our development programs. And you know, that's been required because we've spent, as you said, you know, come up to £500 million already on our you know, fire safety and building safety. And within our business plans, you know, we have much more which goes out over a larger number of years. You know, that's where that 3.6 billion comes from. But you know, we've already spent £500 million. So you know, when developers are saying this is a huge amount of money, and of course we're going to pay for what we've done wrong, but you know, we shouldn't be paying for other people's mistakes. We're already doing that, and you know, we've got a huge waking watch costs. Nobody wants to pay for these waking watch costs. I totally understand. But they're there because experts, which we have to rely on, say you have to have a waking watch in place. Then you put a fire alarm system in place. And we haven't been able to access some of those waking watch funds because we've acted quickly. You know, we've acted already. So we're not able to go to some of those waking watch funds that have then subsequently come out. And you can't retrospectively go back and get that money. So, we've already incurred, and we are incurring every day, huge amounts of money for breaking water, which there is nowhere to go. There is no one who will pay for these costs other than ourselves. And
would you put those cuts, the majority of those cuts, the G15 development programs, down to the fire safety? Or, I mean, obviously there are other pressures weighing on housing associations, like need to invest in net zero and like rising build costs and all other, and the London housing market hasn't been very strong for a few years. There are other reasons, I suppose, why people might not develop. But would you put the majority of those cuts down to this?
Absolutely, I would, because all of that is coming. How we're going to pay for decarbonisation. Actually, the sales market, I know everybody sort of says it's slower in London, but it's still strong. It's just the rest of the country's gone bananas. So it's kind of, it's still a strong sales market in London. It's probably just the price hike hasn't been as high as elsewhere, but actually the sales market is strong in London. So obviously everybody's always looking at all the headwinds, and we've got huge headwinds coming, haven't we, with inflation and interest rates rising. That's kind of and decarbonisation, as you say, sort of tomorrow's problems. Today's problems has been around reducing the development programme, absolutely, because of the costs which have been met. You can't, there is only so many ways you can meet these costs, and there's only so many things you can reduce, and therefore, that is the most immediate one.
And how worried are you that the government might, as is the threat, that the government might end up actually cutting back on the affordable housing programme if enough funding isn't forthcoming from the private sector for fire safety? Was the kind of threat, I suppose, in the implicit threat in the Treasury letter that got leaked a while back.
I mean, it would be incredibly it would be terrible if that happened, because there is such need, and given organisations, as I say, housing associations, are already cutting back. If funding was cut further, then we will just go from one crisis to another. So housing benefit bills are going up, private rental rents are going up. So the money, you look at the revenue side, you look at the capital side, and if you don't put it into bricks and mortar and building new homes, you've got a bigger and longer revenue bill which goes out even further. So it's, of course, there are huge pressures on government. Totally understand that they've got limits to what they can do and where they can put their money, but this would be really problematic, particularly for social renters, because waiting lists are not going down, they're going up.
Are you entirely comfortable with government going after developers in the way that it has done, raising these threats of stopping them from getting planning permission, etc.? I mean, do you think it's appropriate, given that developers' extent of responsibility for this problem?
Yeah, I do think that somebody has to pay. There are obviously implications in terms of changing regulation over the years and responsibilities there, but there is a limit really to what we as housing associations can do, and as I said, it's concentrated amongst those who have the biggest problems. So those who have that responsibility should, but that does include manufacturers of material as well, not just developers and contractors, but those who have produced products which are clearly liable, haven't met the sort of standards. So you could extend that further in terms of that, and I suppose it's a bit like a sort of a sort of prosperity. There's this sort of tax on profits, isn't there? There has been high profits, there has been a lot of help through Help to Buy. So where sectors have had help, over time, then there's a responsibility to sort of pay back as well. And I don't think most developers or most within that developer community are saying they will make a contribution. I suppose it's the extent of it, and this is the issue, isn't it? Is how big is the pot and how much are different organisations, sectors going to be putting into that pot? We have also made the suggestion that this is VAT exempt. Now, obviously, that would be a cut in revenue to government, but it would make the money go much further, and that could be a contribution, which is a sort of tax liability that's reduced. We think that's quite a good idea, because it means that would really help in terms of, as I said, there's a lot coming up over the next few years. There's a lot of works that are required over the next few years. That's going to be a lot of activity, and therefore, if there was an exemption on that VAT, that money would go a lot further, and we could do a lot more.
I mean, people have been arguing, I suppose, for a broader exemption for VAT on retrofit, or for a equalisation of VAT rules for new build and retrofit for as long as I've been writing about this stuff, and it hasn't gone down well. Have you had any response back to that suggestion? I mean, just interested if there's any signs of any appetite or any movement on that, because I have to say it always sounds incredibly sensible whenever it's suggested, but that doesn't seem to ever move anyone in the Treasury.
Yeah, and I think that there is the answer, really, Joey, isn't it? It's Treasury are obviously looking after the pennies and focusing really on their income. And there's always been times when you think, okay, sales are booming, there's going to be Treasury are going to be doing really well through sales income. This might be a time just to have a period where you've got VAT exemption, particularly, like you say, retrofit works, etc., that are coming up. It would be a really good opportunity to give a boost there. I haven't seen any signs of chink of light in this, I'm afraid. So, but I think we can keep going, can't we?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, do you think? And I'll move on from this kind of thing about responsibility after this. But to what extent? And you've mentioned the changing building regulations situation, and we've all heard the testimony coming out from the Grenfell inquiry in recent weeks. I mean, in your view, to what extent does the government share the responsibility for paying for this situation, given given its responsibility for setting up the system that allowed buildings to be built in this way by both housing associations and developers, private developers?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite difficult to go back and unpick every stage, isn't it? But there have been stages over many years, which has kind of led to the situation we're at. I think, I suppose my point, Joey, is we shouldn't be paying, and our renters, our social renters shouldn't be paying, and our leaseholders shouldn't be paying. So, however that fund is made up, it needs to be there to solve the problem, and not, and future people who are not going to get a home shouldn't be paying either. That, which was my point earlier, is if we're going to be not building those new homes, then people are going to be stuck in temporary accommodation or in unsafe homes for longer in different sectors. So they shouldn't be paying for it. And we could go round in circles around, where does that responsibility and liability begin? But it is the government's responsibility to ensure there is a fund which is available, which ensures we can get on with fulfilling this and solving the problem.
Yeah. Are you confident we're getting towards that now, at least a point at which there is a fund and people can see a way forward?
Yes.
We haven't actually got a deal between the government yet and the developers on this.
No, but I do think there will be one. I think the most important point I want to make is our access to that fund, and the fact this is not going to be a quick solution. I think people sort of think once the fund is done, the deal is done, that's it, you know, we can move on. But we're not going to be moving on from this, because the negotiations with, you know, developers, contractors, the whole industry, you know, the fact that you've got RICS, you've got fire assessors, you've got the fire brigade, you know, you've got all these parties who are still involved in making assessments, and and then negotiations around what is the right remediation that's required. That can take a year sometimes just to get to the point of agreement around what the specification should be for the remediation of a building, because you've got detailed negotiations going on between two parties. So all of this is going to take a long time, and there will be, as I said, there's the future bit that we need to think of as well, you know, the requirements. And I saw today a headline around Michael Gove saying that there may not need to be fire safety managers because leaseholders are worried about costs, which will be in the service charges. I don't think, you know, we're not done and dusted on this. There's still going to be a lot of discussion underway, and you know, there will be parties who probably close shop during this time as well, who, you know, are not going to be around, and being able to say that you can take legal action for a longer period of time is fine, but there is going to be court action and legal action, and that goes on for a long time. Costs are involved before some of this is resolved. So, you know, I suppose my worry is we can have a fund, we can have a way forward, but you can't undo what's already done, and therefore this is going to, you know, this is going to be a long-term issue.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a good point to kind of move on. And I said I wanted to get to the issue of proportionality, and I guess you know, that's become a catch-all term for in some ways talking about this issue of what on earth you do with these buildings. You know, to what standard do you remediate them to? You know, how exactly do you repair them? I mean, it's increasing. It appears to be becoming increasingly clear that the government's decision or Michael Gove's decision to cancel the consolidated advice note hasn't resulted in mortgage lenders and in kind of a change of heart from mortgage lenders and insurers in terms of requiring the use of EWS 1 forms for valuation purposes as part of this process. Has that been a surprise for you, or was that something that you expected as part of this? Because I thought that was seen as part of the solution to move on from EWS 1.
Yeah, so I think we've, as G15, we estimate we've got about 22,000 of our residents that are living in buildings that require an EWS 1 certificate, and around 1,000 mortgage transactions are on hold. So, you know, we've been sort of gathering information around this. Very difficult, because obviously if you're in a building that doesn't have an EWS 1 and other people in there need one, you're not going to bother kind of going through the hoops, really. You're going to know that that's the sort of situation, so it's quite difficult to get this information. But yeah, I mean, that is a real frustration, because every time there's an announcement, you think, right, this is going to ensure we've got some movement. But it's very difficult when people know that the quality of buildings has been, you know, when there's a problem with the quality of buildings, then they look at their own risk appetite, and you know, that's what's happened, hasn't it? The Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors and lenders have looked at their own risk appetite, and you know, whatever's come out said, well, this is our risk appetite, and this is how we're assessing it, and this is what we require. So things haven't moved forward as we've wanted them to. We keep hoping, you know, we keep thinking, oh, well, maybe now this time this will unlock things for people. but yeah, I think there's more work to be done, and you know, one of the potential impacts, obviously, of the new PAS 9980 is that, you know, is there going to be a requirement to open up buildings in order to
PAS 99, sorry, to be clear, PAS 9880 is the new guidance, which is supposed to support a more proportionate approach to remediation of buildings and a more kind of risk-based approach.
That's right.
In case people aren't familiar with that.
Yeah, so that's been introduced recently. Sorry, Joe. Yeah, so just an explanation of it. But you know, looking at it, how are you supposed to be able to fulfil that guidance? And a lot of assumption is really around, you know, in order to be able to confirm the makeup of that external wall, you're still going to have to do some opening up of the building, and then once you've done that, there will be other problems which are identified. So I think this whole issue around proportionality and, you know, what you do and how do you sort of close the loop on all of this is going to be complicated until we have much more clarity around that and we understand how different parties are going to deal with it. Because, you know, people say, well, housing associations should take a proportionate approach, but we're not experts. You know, we rely on experts in the same way that everyone else relies on experts. So, you know, we're going to rely on experts to tell us how to implement things and also the results of that, and we're going to have to follow that expert advice. So, you know, my earlier point, which was really around everybody in the industry has to be behind and have the same understanding of what's required, otherwise we're not going to move forward as much as we want. So I think there's a lot of discussion around it, and there is this new guidance that's come out. We just have to see how that settles down, and also, you know, what the impact is going to be of it and what needs to change if that doesn't give us the impact we need.
So far then, so I'm trying to interpret what you're saying. So far, have you seen any signs of any progress on that since cancellation of the, you know, for your 1,000 people installed transactions? You know, can you report any signs of any kind of loosening of the market for them?
We haven't seen that yet. We haven't seen, you know, there are some lenders who are now saying they are going to start moving, you know, that they are going to, you know, relook at their criteria and where an EWS1 is required. You know, so there has been some talk about it. What we haven't seen is the actual action and the ability for people to be able to access a wider range of mortgage providers who haven't been as stringent really around that. So we're still waiting to see, you know, the impact. And all of this is quite new. You know, it doesn't sort of happen. The announcement doesn't happen and then the next day it all gets implemented. So what happens is residents contact us and say, oh, we understand that's now changed. So, you know, hopefully I'll be able to move now. But then they get disappointed because they don't see the results of that as written in the press or as promoted as, you know, maybe the answer to what they want. So, you know, all the time you're sort of dealing with people's expectations and how you can, you know, manage those expectations and limited by what you see with other providers and, you know, other lenders. So yeah, we haven't seen the shift really yet.
And is there a frustration with, I mean, I suppose everyone understands the ROCS, you know, their surveyors have a responsibility for the people that they're carrying out surveys on behalf of. But there must be a frustration amongst housing associations, as I know there is amongst developers, at the attitude that they're taking on this issue, that everyone wants a more kind of proportionate approach to be taken, but it doesn't seem to be happening.
Yes, and this is where you need everybody talking together. You know, so you've got the Fire Safety Act, you've got the Building Safety Bill, you've got the EWS criteria, then you've got PAS 980, you've got different announcements, and you know, it's really making sure that one act doesn't sort of act against another act. So the requirements in one isn't acting against the requirements in another. So, you know, it's almost like, you know, peeling an onion, isn't it? It's like you kind of take off one layer and think, okay, that's resolved. And what we keep saying is we've got to look at the inner core. You know, there's more coming, and unless we solve that problem down the line, you can close the gate here and we can all deal with the over 18 meters. We can even get to a point, even though there's over 4,000 of them amongst the G15, of the over 11 meters, but we're never going to deal with the whole situation until we make sure that actually the acts are aligned, the guidelines are clear, and everybody in the industry is working to the same aim. And I suppose that's our real worry.
Right. Wow. And that sounds like quite a challenge. And that's one that I guess you can only do with government and with government looking at the legislation.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, it's you know, the biggest issue, and everybody is talking about. People understand this, that we need to get proportionality right, but we can't do that alone. And I think that's the kind of sort of key message. As housing associations, we can say we want a proportionate approach, but if, you know, the fire risk assessors, you know, the mortgage lenders, the insurers, the fire brigade are all working to a sort of different criteria, then, or interpreting things differently, then, you know, we're not going to be able to move this situation alone. We're the ones sort of holding the residents and holding the buildings and holding the you know, the situation. And, you know, as I said, there has been a lot of movement, Joey, so I don't want to sort of, you know, end this on a it's all doom and gloom, because things have moved forward and we are getting, you know, responses and some clarity and some movement really in terms of the situation. But this is a really big bit. We really need to make sure the Fire Safety Act, the draft fire safety bill, the PAS note, the guidance, and the industry are all very much aligned so that we can get a proportionate approach in, and then, you know, just release people from the absolute hell they've been living through.
Indeed. Geeta, just as a final thing, if you had one piece of your advice for your colleagues in the housing association sector kind of facing similar issues to you around the fire safety challenge, to you, as it were, what would it be for how to approach all of this? What are the kind of key things you've learned?
I think, you know, it's having dedicated resource, so making sure there's a team, people, responsibilities within the organisation who can spend the time with the residents, you know, put the processes in place and look forward, because as I said, it's, you know, what's coming is obviously having a proper data records, training of people, recruiting of people who are going to be able to deal with the building safety case, etc., going forward. So don't lose sight of, just because there's a lot to be done currently for buildings, you know, where you've got current issues and problems, you've also got to look ahead and make sure that you're sort of planning, you know, for the new act and the safety regulations. And the other thing is, you know, there is nothing more important than safety. You know, it's our responsibility. You know, we have to make those decisions, and it's not all going to be laid out for us. So sometimes we have to take those risks and decisions around what we do, because otherwise, you know, you get completely stuck. So, you know, be open, be clear with your board, with your colleagues in the organisation, that we just have to keep moving forward on this.
Brilliant. Geeta, thank you so much. I think that's a great place to leave it, a positive place to leave it. Geeta, thank you so much for your time and for all your insight here today. It's been really brilliant to speak to you. If anyone watching has enjoyed this or learned anything, please remember to tell people about it. You can tweet on social media, use the hashtag HTLive. And please remember to check out the rest of the program later in the day. Thanks everyone for watching. Thanks very much.